the American dream lived out. But then we talked about some of the current elements in the environment, whether it's ESG or the administrative state, the political overhang to the free market system. I mean, you use the term allocation of capital multiple times, and that references what's the best way to allocate your investment capital to get the best return both for the individual and for society. And when you start throwing in these other factors, you misallocate capital, whether it's zero interest rates or whatever. So what are your solutions? What would you do to fix the problem that we're facing?
Well, if I'm advising Joe Biden, the first thing I'd say is, Joe, knock out the war on oil and gas and fossil fuels and coal, and also start adding in some healthy investment in nuclear, which is a long-term sustainable clean energy. We have to remember that the world's been lifted out of poverty in the last 150, 200 years because of at least 150 years because of the oil and gas revolution. Even the internal combustion engine has made the world a vastly more wealthy place. And of course, developing economies also depend on it. And so when we say we're going to go to wind and solar, we're basically saying, let's invest in 12th century technology. That's not a good way to go. So you deal with the energy issue first, and also that helps us with our national security, because then we become energy independent. One of the byproducts of wind and solar is most of the equipment that provides wind and solar energy comes from China. And so it's we can get into a long discussion about that. I think that the next thing you need to talk about is our money, and I sound like an old time Republican, but even Republicans have lost the mantra. We need to stop spending insane amounts of money. It's a massive misallocation of capital. Government does not know where to invest. And worse, a lot of it's going to subsidize wealthy investors. If you look at one of the big bills, there's almost $1 trillion in subsidies that go to wealthy investors for climate infrastructure. And they want to do things like build massive power lines from solar fields, wind fields out in the middle of nowhere to get it down to Los Angeles. Well, that's hundreds of billions of dollars that need not be spent if we relied on oil and gas. So, and then you mentioned the regulatory state. I mean, there's a whole of government approach now. Every single agency in government is really focused more on a social justice agenda and focused on climate. If we can get maybe the Department of Education, to pick an example, to get out of that and just maybe focus on reading, writing, and arithmetic, we do a lot of good. It's a long list, Kevin, but I think there are a few there's a lot of low-hanging fruit given how badly Joe has mismanaged this.
And you make that point on education. If we would be training engineers and scientists, it would make a huge difference. And then the other thing is the debt. As you mentioned, we have $32 trillion in debt. Last I looked, we've spent about $30 trillion in the war on poverty that Johnson brought out. So almost all of our debt, and yet the war on poverty hasn't had any victory. In fact, poverty is as challenging now as it was in the 1960s when he brought this whole wealth transfer mechanism in place.
Well, the war on poverty, I shouldn't laugh, has been just a catastrophic failure. And it not only failed economically to lift people out of what they define as poverty, but the social costs have been enormous. It basically destroyed the black family. I had Robert Woodson on my show, and he points out that in 1959, 1960, the marriage rate among the black community was higher than that among the white community, and they had thousands and thousands of thriving businesses and churches, and they were doing just fine. And along came Lyndon Johnson and all the disincentives they created to make the welfare state, and look what's happened to our cities now. Not only cities, but rural white America as well.
Yeah, well, he actually achieved his objective, though, which wasn't to end poverty. It was to get the African-American community voting Democrat reliably and repeatedly, which was quite the accomplishment for a politician, given the fact that the Republicans led the civil rights movements. The Republicans were the ones with Lincoln to end slavery. There were very few black Democrats in the 1950s until the war on poverty took place.